So welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Tom Golding, I'm the president of Vuelio, and I'm delighted to be joined by our very own Insights lead, Hollie Parry, who has been recently researching today's topic on crisis comms. Good morning, Hollie.
Morning, Tom.
Morning. As hopefully many of you know, our Insights team helps clients through detailed qualitative and quantitative analysis on data, supporting topics such as evaluation of media impact, industry issues, and positioning of competitors. So we've recently launched a series of webinars using work from our Insights team. And apart from showcasing this work, it's really here to share some of the learnings we think are interesting to you based on what the data has told us. We'll be exploring more topics around the PR and communication space, and we'd love to hear from you of what you think is interesting for us to explore. And you can make your suggestions through the chat today or by contacting Vuelio directly. So on to today, Hollie will be exploring crisis comms across three sectors, which have been through, and in some cases are still going through, times of crisis, and really using the media insights to provide a framework for best practice. So that's today's topic. Please do use the Q&A function or chat function if you'd like to post questions on anything that Hollie covers. And what we'll do is at the end, we'll leave enough time to be able to answer those questions. So really, I'll hand straight over to Hollie, who will now start to go through today's webinar.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. So today, as Tom said, we're going to go through some examples of crisis. I'm going to walk you through some short, mid and long-term examples that I'm sure many of you are aware of over the past year. We're going to be looking at which brands successfully managed the crisis, where some areas of improvement could be, why proactivity really stood out compared to reactivity, why silence can be really fatal, and some top tips at the end based on what we've learned from the data over the past year. So a short-term example that we're going to look into is the 2022 FIFA World Cup. As, again, I'm sure many of you are aware, when it took place, when it was decided that it was going to take place in Qatar, there were a lot of political controversies and human rights concerns that were a big risk to the brands that chose to participate in the event, as well as the public figures. I'm sure many of you saw the news around whether or not David Beckham should be involved, so things like that. But for the brands who chose to participate, a lot of strategy went into making sure that they could both maintain their brand reputation, honor the requests of the event, and also keep themselves looking positive and not for some of the concerns that were going on at the time. So we're going to look into the 7 FIFA partners primarily for this study. The Insights team throughout November and December last year monitored the coverage that was coming in, and we've monitored the 7 FIFA partners that chose to participate in the event. So to the left here, we have the share of voice chart, which 100% is all sentiment, so positive and negative coverage. But to the right here, we have how proactive each brand was. So what you can actually see is that how proactive each brand was directly reflects how much coverage they had by the end. So Adidas, Hyundai, Kia and Visa, who were the most proactive of the FIFA partners, they actually did really well in their overall international coverage. We monitored international online news coverage only. But what we could actually see was that something really successful for Adidas and Hyundai Kia particularly were that they released messaging that both addressed and didn't address the concerns that were going on in Qatar at the time. So for example, whilst Hyundai Kia chose to do some public statements on their website about how they were for human rights and for paying the labour that was underpaid at the time. That wasn't something that they pushed heavily because there were some risks involved with the event itself, but they did address it. But what they also did was took advantage of some other things that were going on in November, primarily COP27, This was a really genius move because what they did was launched a goal of the century campaign, which was around sustainability. So they knew that it would get a lot of volume, but they tied it into FIFA. So this was a way of saying, we are sustainable, we've got these net zero initiatives, but they tied it into the event. So it was a really good way of not directly addressing what was actually going on because of the risks that were involved with doing that, but also trying to be more brand positive and dilute some of the negative coverage that was coming in for them. On the other hand, Coca-Cola, who sort of fell within the mid-range, you can really see that with the mid-range of their overall share of voice. They released one crisis-related campaign rather than airing into other sides of ESG, titled Believing is Magic, and they released it really early on, actually in 2022 compared to other brands, and that was maybe fell on their part as maybe not the best thing for the overall performance. And it goes to show that this proactivity is really important, but you can be too proactive. And by the time that the event started and the Qatar criticisms were coming in towards the brands and what their ethics may be, the news was no longer interested in their Believing is Magic campaign. And they didn't address any public statements either towards what was going on, which seemed to work in favor for Adidas, Hyundai, Kia and Visa. And when we look over to Qatar Airways, Wonder Group and Qatar Energy, for understandable reasons, some of them didn't choose to address some of the political concerns, considering where they're based. But not only that, they were not proactive in their coverage at all, or they were completely silent. And what's particularly interesting about this is that Wonder Group in 2018 chose to release a Women First FIFA-related campaign. And that did really well for their international coverage, whereas they've chosen to say nothing in 2022, maybe to avoid any media awareness, but it didn't work in their favour. And what we found is that news publications around the UK were still wondering, who is Wonder Group, what are their ethical positions, but there was nothing to draw from because they're not a well-known brand in the UK in comparison to some of the other partners involved. So silence really, it didn't hide them from the press, it only made more room for guessing. And the negative sentiment score was much higher than it was in 2018. So moving on to coverage over time and top stories and sentiment, below we have a bit of a traffic light system. So who was the most, mid and least proactive. And what we can see is that Adidas produced the most consistent peaks of international coverage. And that was because they released the strongest diversity of messaging. Whilst they both addressed human rights concerns in some ways, they also chose to have be the lead brand in the tech football that was able to show whether or not a score really took place. So they invested a lot in the sport itself, so that there was a lot to talk about throughout the event, aside from the pure fact that they were involved in a controversial event. Visa, on the other hand, whilst they were really proactive, something that I really like about how they performed was that they only really pushed one thing, which was their expenditure report in response to the cost of living crisis. So they measured how people were spending at the events alongside inflation, which again is a really good way to know that you're going to get a lot of volume, so it's a hot topic. But rather than releasing a lot of different messaging, they built a lot of suspense building up to the event. And then when actually released at the end of the event, it was a really big hit and it was an international success. And again, really powerful way to dilute from some controversial coverage on what their incentives may be in investing in a World Cup in Qatar. Hyundai Kia, as I mentioned earlier, their goal of the century campaign was really successful, but the pure fact that they led in the middle here was because there was less pushing around social media, whereas Adidas and Visa chose to talk about a lot of their campaigns on Twitter. Hyundai Kia didn't, and that actually really showed with their performance, presumably because there was a lot of conversation on Twitter throughout the World Cup. And again, Wonder Group, Qatar Energy and Qatar Airways, because they didn't choose to release a lot of messaging, or because they were reactive only, Qatar Energy were quite reactive in their public statements rather than pushing any campaigns, and they released no proactive messaging. They had a very low positive prominence and a very high negative prominence, which basically means that for the coverage that they did get, their name was in the spotlight for the negative coverage, in headlines, a big part of the text of the article itself, whereas their positive prominence was not as good. So the positive coverage, it was more passive mentions of who they might be, and it wasn't necessarily considered as negative coverage, which means that the quality of what they had overall was much less than other partners. So moving on to a medium-term crisis, again, a very well-known one that went on for a lot of the first half of 2022 was the UK airline strikes. There was a lot that went into this event, that went into this crisis. So initially it was strikes and cancellations, but then it ended up also being that oil prices were being impacted because of inflation, and that was when the Ukraine war began. So there was a lot going on the airlines were dealing with, and it was quite an extended crisis that was furthering cancellations and furthering strikes. So it almost seemed as if there was no end for these brands. So what the Vuelio Insights team did was measured the UK airlines coverage and saw how they responded to such a multifaceted crisis, and compared it to their overall performance to see who did best and how that was tied to proactive release. So here we have a coverage over time chart. This again measures from January to June, although some of the conversation did go on further than that. This was the bulk of the crisis for UK brands themselves. And what we can see here is that British Airways and Ryanair, who were the least proactive and the most reactive, had the least control over their negative peaks. So because they weren't releasing anything for the media to draw on when things came out like Ukrainian family aren't able to board a flight and it's tied to Ryanair or something like that, they weren't able to dilute that coverage with the positive things that they were doing because the media just weren't interested now that something so negative had come out. Whereas if they had released those positive things that they were doing beforehand, it may not have hit so hard for them and they would have had more control over their peaks over time. TUI, who pushed, this kind of like Coca-Cola, they fell quite mid-range. They pushed some proactive public statements from their exec chair, which demonstrated some control over their negative coverage, not more than the most reactive, but not quite as much as the most proactive, which was by far Virgin Atlantic, who demonstrated low and controlled coverage throughout the entire event. And honestly, compared to the other UK airlines, this is what we're going to focus on throughout this small section, is really how Virgin Atlantic stood out as a proactive brand and how that really impacted their low and controlled coverage throughout the crisis in comparison to other UK airlines. So here we have key themes, which outlines the multiple topics within the crisis that each of the airlines were dealing with. Whilst Virgin Atlantic and TUI had similarly low volumes, the really interesting thing to know from that is that the Virgin Atlantic coverage was 92% positive, whereas TUI's coverage was 21.5% positive. So it was a much different overall sentiment score, even though they had roughly the same volumes. And the thing we can learn from that is that when we're actually measuring our crisis comms, our parameters and our goals are maybe slightly different, and volume doesn't quite matter as much. Because really we want to just be maintaining that sentiment and maintaining that brand reputation as opposed to trying to get a lot of coverage. Virgin Atlantic were the only airline among the top 5 to try and succeed in earning prominent coverage from a positive press release while still going through a crisis. So whilst they were equally affected by things like cancellations, They, at the same time, chose to release their See the World Differently campaign, which was everywhere over broadcast media at the time and continued to be a hit throughout the year, which was around non-gendered clothing and a relaxed tattoo policy. So again, that's hitting on the we can't necessarily directly address this crisis, so we're going to hit a different element of ESG, much like Hyundai and Kia, but they opted for the diversity aspect instead of the sustainability aspect. And that really worked well with diluting some of the negative coverage. And what we can also see here is that the key message penetration is dramatically different with proactive and reactive brands. So EasyJet and Ryanair, who are much more reactive, versus Virgin Atlantic, who already had a plethora of press releases ready to go and ready to pick up from before crisis hit for them as a brand personally, was massively different. And what we could see was that the media was much more interested in covering positive things about the brand before negative things hit, whereas when negative stories hit, there was a much lower chance of them picking up on your story afterwards. We can see here that the key message penetration for EasyJet and Ryanair was around 15%, whereas for Virgin Atlantic it was 73%, so a huge difference in when you time those press releases. And here we have sentiment score, which combines all topics, so oil prices, baggage loss, the Ukraine crisis, everything combined. And what we can see is that, again, even though they have the lowest volume, Virgin Atlantic really demonstrated the best balance of positive to negative coverage. One of the most successful press releases actually was what boosted the second best performer, which was EasyJet. So their positive coverage is actually quite similar, but the reason that is because of Virgin Atlantic. So there was a partnership between Virgin Atlantic and EasyJet for a Ukraine football relief match, and Virgin Atlantic's proactive push on this message, whereas EasyJet didn't, actually still boosted EasyJet's positive prominence massively. So it also just goes to show the huge benefit of partnerships in a crisis as well, with those who may be struggling with the same thing. We also did a little bit of a focused exploration into the Ukraine crisis and the share of voice, because that was really something that Virgin was shining with their positive coverage in. So we wanted to know how they really performed on that specific thing compared to other airlines. And what we could see is that actually they had the most positive coverage throughout March, whereas Ryanair, who were the least proactive and the most reactive, had the most negative coverage throughout March. And Virgin Atlantic were also the only airline to not appear in negative Ukraine-related coverage for British Airlines throughout the entire measured period. So it really just does go to show how impactful their consistent press releases were at this time. And lastly, an example of a long-term crisis that we're going to go into is the Green Pharma race to net zero. So during November last year, after the COP27 event, it was announced that pharmaceutical companies were going to have to start making actionable, visible steps towards climate strategies. And if they won't, then their operational licenses could be at risk. So this has been a huge thing for the pharmaceutical industry, because its sustainability is no longer a luxury to appease to either audiences or investors. It's really now a necessity that will otherwise be a huge risk for their brand. And it's making a huge difference, and you can really see since COP27, a lot of the biggest brands have been releasing their strategies because they knew that the media would be interested. So here we can see we measured international coverage for this event, and we looked into climate-related pharmaceutical coverage in the news and in trade publications across science and pharma. And what we can see is that by and large, the UK produced much more coverage than any other country. and they also produced the most branded coverage. So that's something quite interesting to see, that primarily the same names came up, and for who the media were interested in exploring, but the UK produced the most coverage overall. Here we have top stories and sentiment. What's actually quite interesting here is that even though there were over 13,000 articles worldwide on pharma-related climate incentives after COP27, the same pieces came up multiple times for GSK, Merck, Roche, AstraZeneca, and Samsung Biologics, which was that 7 CEOs announced efforts to curb emissions in healthcare. So again, even though there were thousands and thousands of articles to explore here, this one very prominent topic was huge across the world, and it goes to show again the power of partnerships. And also, when you look at the sentiment here as well, compared to the previous reports that we've explored, this is a really strong example of a well-handled crisis across the industry. The majority of the biggest companies did really well overall, apart from Bayer, unfortunately, who were the only brand to not release a proactive statement on climate incentives at the same time as the others. So you can really see here, Bayer kind of aligns with Ryanair in waiting too long. And lastly, something interesting about this is that whilst Samsung Biologics and AstraZeneca were mentioned in this 7 CEOs headline and got the benefits of that partnership, continuing with diverse messaging, kind of like Adidas and Hyundai Kia, really worked in their favor, because they did their own internal climate incentive release, and it ended up being their top headline. So you could really see that the media were really interested in knowing what they were doing at this time. Samsung Biologics, actually, it was one of their recognitions for creating a sustainable future that really served them, and that was a really important thing to do for their brand that we've seen to be successful throughout all of the reports we've looked into. So, for example, accreditations and awards are a really good way to divert from things like greenwashing and woke washing that come up so easily and can have a really long-term impact on your brand in today's interest. So, yeah, it just goes to show that the power of having that additional reliability in your brand. Another example is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, particularly for science-focused brands. It's an initiative that thousands of brands are now joining, where you have the assurance from an external company to show that you're making actionable steps towards climate incentives. And what we found in our research is that those who are part of the Science-Based Targets Initiative have much more respect and chance of positive media awareness in scientific journalism than those who don't. So it just goes to show just how powerful that additional accreditation or award can be as a powerful crisis tactic. So rounding up what we've looked at throughout all of our reports and overall, we have 8 top tips from the Vuelio Insights team for things that keep coming up that you could really take going forward. Number 1 is to time your press releases. Virgin Atlantic clearly use press releases as a prevention tool. Yes, there's a lot of conversation around, is the press release dead? Should we keep it going? Journalists don't listen to them as much anymore, but they do just save them. Just save them for when you really need them. And that's when they'll really count, and you will be listened to because eyes are already on you. So don't drop the idea of a press release altogether, because it's really visible in how Virgin Atlantic handled that low and controlled reputation throughout the airline crisis. Number 2 is don't stay silent, particularly as a lesser known brand. Wonder Group is a clear example of that, and how they performed in 2018 when they released an ESG campaign versus 2022 when they said nothing at all. It's not going to reduce your media awareness. It's only going to leave more room for guessing around your ethics and your opinions on the crisis. Number 3 is to diversify your messaging wherever possible. Release messaging around the crisis, of course, but also around other efforts where possible. For example, if your crisis is based around political concerns, maybe do it around sustainability, or show your efforts in other areas. So that's something powerful that we found that works as well. Don't wait too long. In other words, don't be too reactive, or if you're going to be reactive, make sure you're still being proactive. Because the media just aren't interested. If something negative has come out about you, there's a much lower key message penetration rate when you wait too long. Number 5 is to consider your relevant crisis metrics. So again, touching on how volume isn't exactly something to be striving for in a crisis, and how you should sort of alter what you're measuring in this, because your goal is going to be different when you're trying to maintain your brand in a crisis. Number 6 is to be consistent. Visa proves that you don't have to release tons of different messaging, but if you are, keep that message going before, through, and after the crisis duration. And it doesn't have to be tons of messaging, but if it is, just don't wait too long, and continue to build suspense around it, because that's still an effective way and something good to do if you're on a tight budget as well. Number 7, enhance your reliability, such as accreditations and awards. Looking at the farmer example, joining an initiative or getting an additional award or an accreditation. And finally, to use your partnerships, Virgin Atlantic and EasyJet, or farmer CEOs coming together. All of these are examples of just how powerful it can be to team up and work together to share some positive messaging and really help to reduce your negative coverage. That's everything from me. I think we might have time for a couple of questions. Tom, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks, Holly. 3 fascinating kind of case studies. I know actually the fuller reports are much more detailed, but I think some good lessons that have been drawn out there. There are a few questions that have come in, so please keep just adding to either the Q&A or the chat function. We have a bit of time to go through. So just going through some of those. One question here is, you mentioned how some brands in the airline and World Cup report chose to release messaging around other ESG topics at the time of the crisis or the event. What were they and how did they perform?
Yeah, so again, just to reiterate on the point of diversifying messages, so 2 in this report at least were the Goal of the Century Sustainability Campaign that Hyundai Kia released. That was one of the most interesting to me, because the way that they knew that it was going to get volume because COP27 was going on at the time, but they tied it into FIFA. That was a really strong way of directly diluting negative coverage tied to the World Cup and tied to being a FIFA partner, whilst also successfully sharing positive messaging. So they were really able to double up on it being both media interest around sustainability and around FIFA at the time. So they really did perform really well, and their positive sentiment was much higher than other brands who didn't choose to do that. Yeah, that's one of the many in there, and the other is the Ukraine crisis football relief event between EasyJet and Virgin Atlantic. That's another strong way of not directly addressing everything that was going on in the airline crisis at the time, but picking on one specifically and showing that they can be a charitable cause.
Fantastic. Another question is, other than issuing a reactive statement to the press, are there other examples of reactive crisis management we can tap into?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Other than issuing a reactive statement to the press, are there other examples of reactive crisis management we can tap into?
I suppose I would say not to be reactive and to as much as possible, and to be proactive. If you are going to be reactive, continue to prioritize the proactive. It comes down to that, don't wait too long. When we look at Ryanair, who are primarily reactive and not so proactive, that really did impact their key message penetration rate overall. So yes, if you are going to be reactive by releasing public statements, or by using Twitter, for example, which is a common way of doing it these days, make sure you're still releasing those public statements ahead of time to show the positive efforts you're doing towards the crisis or in other areas.
Right, and there's one on timing here. You mentioned that going too early didn't work for one brand. but that it was important to put stuff out proactively. Those brands that did well, did they put positive stuff out before the human rights story started to dominate or after?
Yes, definitely before. So to give you some more insight into that, so when we look at Coca-Cola's Believing is Magic campaign, they released it in June, and the positive and the controversial coverage around Qatar being tied into FIFA didn't really kick off until around October. Yes, there was some negative coverage when it was initially announced a few years prior, but it really kicked off again around September, October. So kicking off in June with the Believing is Magic campaign just made it not as interesting by the time that controversial coverage was actually coming around. Whereas those who were proactive in the right way and it served their brand, we saw them releasing the messaging around 4 to maybe 6 weeks prior at the most, and continuing to really drive that message up until the event began, and then altering their strategy, maybe taking a little bit off of broadcast and more online through Twitter as the event began, because that's where the conversation moved.
Right, and actually the question here that I was going to ask as well, but there's one on, can proactive sometimes fuel an issue or draw more attention to it?
Interesting question. Can it draw, could you repeat that? Could you repeat the phrasing again?
Can proactive sometimes fuel an issue or draw more attention to it?
By an issue, if you mean the crisis itself, well, I guess the thing is that, like I was saying with Wonder Group, there's no such thing as, it seems, from hiding from the press altogether. So it may not be driving the crisis issue itself, because it's already existing and it's already a source of media discussion. And if you've planned ahead for what you know is likely going to affect your brand, then you're not going to be enhancing the messaging around it or the awareness towards it. You're just going to be preparing for it. And ultimately, if you're releasing positive messaging around other things that you're doing, such as sustainability as a way of handling a crisis related to something different, then you're not going to lose out anyway, because no one's necessarily knowing that you're releasing it as a tactic to divert attention from the crisis at hand. So if by the issue you mean is it drawing more attention to the crisis issue, then I would say that's already existing, and that's already something that you can't escape. So prepare anyway, and then there's no real harm in having positive messaging around good things that you're doing anyway.
Great. There's a question here. Can you say more about the use of social channels versus MSM, mainstream media, in managing negative issues?
Yes, I can speak a little bit to that. So what I will say is that the analysis we do on social channels is lesser so than the news coverage. That's going to be changing more over the next year as we collaborate more with other softwares that are more capable with social channels. But what I will say is that what we've seen is the way that the brands assess how it should move over time is based on where the conversation is going to continue. So, for example, in the FIFA campaign, we saw that in the FIFA World Cup, we saw that brands were moving their campaigns slightly away from broadcast as the event began and further into Twitter, because that's where a lot of the conversation was moving. The hype was built up largely on broadcast, and then it moved towards Twitter over time. So I suppose it's about analyzing where your audience is going to be moving as the crisis continues, or as the event that you're diverting attention around evolves.
Right. I think we've just got 2 more questions that have come in. This relates back to the airlines one. If the message was the same, why was key message penetration lower for Ryanair than Virgin Atlantic?
So the messages weren't the same. So what Virgin Atlantic did was they were sharing a lot of different messaging. This is what we're doing in Ukraine. This is what we're doing for diversity. This is what we're doing for sustainability. This is how we're going to help with cancellations. Whereas Ryanair, their positive statements were so they had some negative press around how they weren't helping Ukraine, or how there wasn't anything to suggest that they were supporting Ukraine. And then when that came out, that's when they released a statement to say, we are doing this and this is what we're doing. And that only really seemed to thrive in some local and regional press, but national news just simply weren't as interested. So what I would say is, yes, the message is kind of the same in that they're trying to share positive actions, but the reason that the key message penetration was so much lower was because they waited, and because negative press had emerged already. So the media just weren't as interested, because the bigger source of conversation was what they weren't doing rather than what they were doing.
Fantastic. And I think this is the last question. And thank you very much for all the feedback in the chat being given. I think we will be sending out the slides, and I'll just check on sending out the recording of the webinar. And I think, but keep them coming in if we want to. The last one was, how did Visa do so well? So back to the first case study, how did Visa do so well with only one major outreach at the end of the World Cup?
Yes. So what they actually did was, and again, this is even though it may not be such an issue for Visa, this is really something to consider if your budget is tight. What they did was that they built a lot of suspense around this report that they were going to do. So again, the report was looking into how people that were going to the World Cup spent their money in a cost of living crisis. So again, tapping into a high interest topic that they knew would get volume. And they built a lot of interest in that. So you could see there was coverage before they actually released the event on Visa said to release report on how people are spending their money. And that was really big in financial publications and business publications too. So it was all about building up suspense and being proactive in it. And again, back to the question earlier, it's about a 4 to 6 week window before the World Cup, at least, that we saw. That was kind of the sweet spot. But that is variable based on the crisis itself.
Great. And there's one just come in. Any advice, thoughts on what to do when a crisis is unanticipated and you have to be reactive?
Yes, absolutely. Of course, that's not an event that we want to end up in, but if that is the case, again, it's about being finding that balance. So having those public statements, making sure that you're pushing out some of your biggest speakers, most influential speakers, and making sure that your comms around that is really on point and considerate of other concerns that may be going on at the time. But overall, just primarily making sure that you have that balance between proactivity and reactivity. So yes, you will be reacting to what's actually going on, and it's going to be a bit of a panic, and having those public statements ready to go so that the news can quote you on what you're saying about the event, but continuing to maybe diversify some of your messaging. So it almost seems proactive, like as the crisis is diluting a little bit, talking about how you've got these sustainability incentives. Another really strong thing to do is look at what's going to be of interest in the media a month from now, and how can you quickly arrange something positive that you can do in that regard. For example, if your crisis broke out unexpectedly a month before Sustainability Week or COP27, you could try and arrange something relatively quickly on how you're supporting climate incentives and working towards net zero, and release it as soon as you can ahead of time, whilst also reacting to the crisis itself. Looking ahead at how to have positive messaging is still going to support what's going on at the time.
Sorry, I was speaking on mute there. So what timescales do you recommend for reactive? Would you issue a holding statement immediately while deciding how to approach a more in-depth response? This is for crises that aren't anticipated.
Yeah, so I would say that there is no harm in being reactive. There is harm in only being reactive. It's really about being as proactive as possible rather than reducing your reactivity altogether. Looking at the reports that we've gone through, what we can see is that the most impacted brands on the negative side of things were only replying and responding to what's actually going on, whereas the ones that sort of acted in mid-range, like Coca-Cola and Hyundai Kia, they were more trying to find that balance between the two. Again, there's no such thing as I think, from the research that we've seen at least, being too reactive, but there's harm in being too little proactive.
Great, thank you, Hollie. I think those are all the questions that are coming through. So really, I think we'll wrap this webinar up now. Just really to thank Hollie for not just for today, but obviously the kind of the passion and you have around this topic and these topics. And also thanks for everyone who's joined the webinar today, given the feedback, given the engagement. This is something that obviously you see value in. So please do, if there are topics, we are running a series of these webinars, then please feedback through our events team, through our website, through our blog, so that we can capture those. We're very keen to get this series set up and run and a regular cadence around it. So many thanks for everyone for joining, and we'll now close out the webinar.
Thanks everyone.